Man, I have not seen such a good progressive appearance on CNN in quite a while. This was kind of a slam dunk for Krystal Ball here. She did a really amazing job on CNN. Now, what's interesting is she's actually on here opposite Andrew Gillum. Okay, Andrew Gillum, if you recall, ran for governor of Florida. He was what seemed to be a pretty good candidate. You know, I watched him in the debates, so I was actually kind of excited for him. I think he was a Bernie fan, or he was picked by Bernie, but then he took a centrist turn at the end of his campaign for some reason. I don't know why. But he's going to end up doing some propaganda for the Joe Biden campaign here, and anti-Bernie propaganda, which we'll talk about in a bit. But there's going to be a pretty lengthy clip. I'm going to show it to you in its entirety, but watch every bit of it. You know, you have to. It's amazing.
She just came out and flat said it. You know, the whole impeachment trial for Trump is just a political hit job to try to smear me because he is scared to death to run against me, and he has good reason to be concerned. You can ruin Donald Trump's night by caucusing for me, and you can ruin Joni Ernst's night as well.
That was former Vice President Joe Biden seizing on remarks by Iowa Senator Joni Ernst that suggested she was eager for the impeachment process to take a political toll on Joe Biden. Joining us now, we have CNN political commentator Andrew Gillum and Krystal Ball, co-author of the new book, The Populist's Guide to 2020, which is doing so well, it is beating the Bolton book on Amazon at the moment.
Maybe you'll be called to testify against that. Maybe you'll
I'm ready. Look, give me a call.
That was an interesting argument there that Joe Biden has not shied away from the political attacks on him. Do you think, Krystal, that he has done a good job of turning the table on those attacks, or do you think some are sticking?
Well, I do think that the impeachment process overall has helped Joe Biden in this race because, number one, it is elevating that he's the center of all of this. Even though a lot of reporting says that Trump is more afraid of Bernie Sanders, the certain perception is that he was fixated on Biden, he was going after Biden. So that's one piece. The other piece is there are real questions about Biden's corruption. I mean, there was just a report out in Politico about a shady land deal involving his brother. This goes back decades, including, relationships with a credit card processor in Delaware, et cetera, et cetera. Those attacks for Democrats have been totally taken off the table because they don't want to give Donald Trump a talking point. So none of that has been able to be brought up in the context of the primary. Of course, if he does become the nominee and make it to the general election, all of that will be very much on the table and front and center coming from Donald Trump.
Well, Donald Trump is the last person who could come after Joe Biden on corruption when you consider that this is the most corrupt administration that we've seen in the history of this country. I would agree that I think the vice president has really leaned into this. Frankly, every time he gets attacked, he gets to make the argument that Republicans are most terrified of running against me, that I'm the most electable Democrat, and they're coming after me because they're terrified of me. But to Senator Ernst's comments, the president is right now in the impeachment process because he solicited help from a foreign government to go against a political adversary. She is now trumpeting the very, very same thing that he is in trouble for in the first place, which is to say, we're going to go after Joe Biden and turn this this process against him. And so I just, they took a solemn oath, and I wish that so many more of the Republicans in the Senate would take that seriously, be deliberative about this, and at least be open to hearing what the facts of the case have to say.
There's a new development apparently overnight out of Iowa, which is there was a discussion between representatives from the Biden campaign and the campaign for Amy Klobuchar to make a deal, perhaps vote swapping in individual caucuses. The way this works, and in each precinct, if you don't get 15%, you're not considered viable, and all the people voting for you get to go to someone else. So what would happen here is if, say, Joe Biden didn't get 15%, but Amy Klobuchar did, the Biden people say, go vote for Amy Klobuchar, and vice versa. The Klobuchar people, at least publicly at this point, are saying, no, we're not into this. But Krystal Ball, what does the fact of these discussions tell you?
Yeah, well, I think it tells you that they can read these polls as well as we can. Biden is slipping. Bernie Sanders is surging. And so if some of the moderates don't combine their forces, you're going to end up with Bernie Sanders coming out of Iowa. And, oh, by the way, he's also up significantly in the polls in New Hampshire. Now, advisors can make whatever deals they want. Ultimately, voters have a mind of their own here. I would tell you, though, that second choice element is really important. That 15% threshold is really important. The other thing to keep an eye on is the fact that Elizabeth Warren in some of these polls has been slipping below the 15% viability threshold as well. Her voters overwhelmingly prefer Bernie Sanders as the second choice. So there's a lot of these dynamics that could play out. But I think it tells you they're looking at the polls and they're saying, we got to do something if we're going to stop Bernie Sanders right now.
Do you find that to be an interesting or curious alliance, the Amy Klobuchar-Joe Biden one?
Well, I mean, they both clearly, in the context of this race, have run the moderate lane. They obviously don't think that they can make this deal with Pete Buttigieg because he's been pretty stable as it relates to his popularity there. But I think more than anything, coming out of Iowa, I'm not certain that we are going to have this landslide victory by any of the candidates. Even if Bernie Sanders is able to pull off a victory there, we're talking about what, between the first 2 or 3 states, 3.5% of the total delegates that will go toward deciding
That is true,
the presidency.
but on the other hand, in modern history, there has never been a candidate who has won Iowa and New Hampshire who has failed to win the nomination. That has never happened. So if you look at a Sanders coming out of Iowa and New Hampshire with 2 wins under his belt going into Nevada, where he's also very strong, you could have a real shift in this dynamic. It actually reminds me of 2008. Joe Biden has a lot of sort of Hillary 2008 energy, right? The polls are there, the institutional support is there, but the energy and enthusiasm isn't. He's sliding in these last days. He never took his main competitor, Bernie Sanders, seriously. And Sanders has a lot of Obama 2008 energy. He's kind of a rock star among his supporters, got this massive grassroots following, big rallies, etc. And they've laid the groundwork in later states to be able to capitalize if he does win early in the same way that Barack Obama did.
Well, I think it's going to be important, however, even if he wins in those first 3 states, that by the time you get to South Carolina, if black voters are not moving in his direction in significant form, I don't see how you can be the front runner for the Democratic nomination without significant African-American support.
Well,
in
he
this
does
party.
have significant African-American support. It's very generational.
It's very
right?
generational,
I mean, that's
absolutely.
what this whole contest has come down to, these generational battle between, older folks in the party who want more of a safer choice. Let's just go back to before Trump. And younger folks are saying, we got to do something. This whole thing wasn't working even before Trump came along. So it's this incredible generational ideological struggle.
Overall, though, the former vice president, enjoys enormous support,
of course,
overwhelming support among African-American voters. The question is, will they stick with him, or will Bernie Sanders, or could Bernie Sanders make inroads with those voters as the primaries go on? There's a generational split among all voters, which is one of the most interesting things about Iowa right now, which is why there's some divergence in the polls. And we're going to talk about this with Harry Etten later in the show. In Iowa, one of the things that's uncertain is that some of the overwhelming support for Bernie Sanders in these recent polls in Iowa comes from younger voters, but often they're not the ones.
Well, I was going to say, the question is will they show up to vote? Now, the enthusiasm is going to be important. But I think Biden's team signaled this week his voters are not the type of voters who are going to sit through a caucus process sort of forecasting that if he didn't perform well, it isn't because he didn't have the support. It's just that older voters, maybe in their opinion, are not going to show up. The subtext here, and I think this is going to be really important for the Biden camp, is that if Vice President Biden does not perform well in these first 3 states, 4 states, does this then open up the possibility of many people considering what Bloomberg may be able to do in this race as we approach Super Tuesday and beyond? My fear with that, obviously, is that you break up a lot of these delegates and we may not end up with a clear nomination.
Sure. I don't mean to interrupt, Krystal, but there was a soundbite that you really wanted to play here, which I do think is...
Well, I mean, I wanted to just talk about if this appeals to independence. That Joe Biden keeps making the case that he won't hold grudges. I mean, he's sort of making the case that he is the anti-President Trump in terms of temperament. So listen to this and tell me if this is winning over people.
These guys are attacking me and my family. I get it. And the press corps with me, they're all good people, follow me. They keep asking me, they just brought up your son, Hunter, and they're doing this and that and the other thing. Well, guess what? I don't hold grudges because presidents can't hold grudges. Presidents have to be fighters, but they also have to be healers.
I just thought that was striking in this moment that we're in right now, getting back to the idea that somehow in some mythical land, a president could bring different sides together and be a healer. Is that a compelling argument right now?
I do think it's a compelling argument, and it's the core of his argument. And this really is the divide, though, because at the same time that you have that, you have 70% of Americans saying that they have a boiling anger at the political establishment. You have 40% who say when they think about our institutions, they want to just burn it all down. So that is really the divide here is if we go back to that time before Trump, that time wasn't so good for a whole lot of Americans. That's why we ended up with Donald Trump. So for a certain segment, yes, it's appealing. That's why he's so durable in the polls. But for another group, a large group with a lot of energy, going back is not enough. I do want to say, look, on the diversity of these two coalitions, I mean, the CNN poll showed Bernie Sanders with the most diverse coalition. So he has a lot of strength across demographics here. We'll see what happens. I think if he comes out of Iowa and New Hampshire with 2 early wins, that could really be a game changer like we saw in 2008.
Krystal Ball, Andrew Gillum, thank you both very much
Great
for
to
the
see
really
you
interesting perspectives. So, the number of U.S. service members.
That was awesome. So there's a lot to talk about there that they went through there. I have to say, overall, I'm disappointed that Andrew Gillum is essentially taking the let me take a piss on the Bernie campaign side or stance. Very disappointing, to say the least. So the first problem that I had there was Andrew Gillum basically saying, "Oh, well, it would be rich if Trump brings up Biden's corruption because this is the most corrupt presidency of all time." Yeah, dude, but we know that that's what he's going to do. He did it back in 2016 as well, and you may think, oh, well, it's different now because he was president. That doesn't make any difference to his supporters. You think that's going to change anything for his supporters? And Krystal brought up a really cogent point there, a very crucial point at that, which is that we are relitigating 2016. We're just going to have not relitigating, we're going to have a replay of 2016, okay, because Biden is taking the Hillary space, and then Trump is going to be Trump. Because Biden is corrupt as hell. Zephyr Teachout wrote a piece breaking this down. He was in the pocket of credit card companies when he was a Delaware senator. He does his big fundraisers. His first one in his election was with the Comcast exec. He does them with fossil fuel execs, etc., etc., etc. Okay, it's literally nonstop. And then you have clear corruption with his son, where his son is raking in $60K a month on that Ukrainian board, and now he works on like a Chinese company or something like that. Obviously, he's just getting paid because he's Joe Biden's son, okay? And he also apparently has some other like issues and whatnot. We won't get into that though. But there's a lot of corruption going on with Joe Biden, absolutely no doubt. And so Andrew Gillum like just pushing, well, it'd be rich because Trump. Yeah, dude, we know that, but people are not going to care, okay? Because Trump at least trumpets an anti-establishment line, whereas Biden doesn't do that. Biden is literally the establishment, okay? So his response is royally stupid there. And then he says, there's not going to be, and this is what he's doing. It's just really crazy. He's basically trying to damper the hopes for Bernie Sanders, and this is exactly what you would expect CNN to do. Now, luckily, they have on Krystal Ball there to push back against it. But the goal of CNN now is essentially be like, oh yeah, Bernie's winning Iowa and New Hampshire, but oh look, small delegate numbers, it's not going to be that big of a deal, relax. Bernie's surge isn't that big, chill out, don't panic, it's all good for the Biden campaign. That's what they're there to do, okay? That is what their goal is. But, and so that's what Gillum's trying to say, but Krystal's there to basically be like, hey, look, the first 2 states are huge in terms of influencing the subsequent elections. That's how it works. Obama had won those 2 and he just went on a roll, and obviously he ended up doing well with black voters as well. And then he brings up South Carolina. Now, South Carolina will not be that big of a deal. Now, hopefully he does well in South Carolina, but the thing about South Carolina is it was really detrimental to Bernie Sanders last time around because he lost South Carolina by like 47 points, whereas this time around, polls have him at down somewhere like 20 points or something like that. And Tom Steyer is polling at 12% consistently in South Carolina for some reason. And we know Tom Steyer really likes Bernie Sanders. So will he drop out right before South Carolina and endorse Bernie Sanders? I don't know. I hope so. Is that going to happen? I'm not sure. But the margins are nowhere near the same as they were last year because Bernie has more black support now and it's split more in the Democratic Party. And so the polls have him down like 20, 27 points, somewhere around there. So, and Biden will only get like 47, whereas Hillary beat him by like 47 points or 50 points or something like that. So the margin isn't going to be nearly as big. Now, I have been trying to say that I really hope that the Bernard Sanders campaign has a really concerted effort to court older voters as well as black voters. And yes, Krystal is correct about the generational split. It is true that in the 18 to 35 bracket, more black people support Bernie Sanders than they do Joe Biden. Now, there was still a bit of a concerning number of 18 to 35ers who support Joe. I was like, wow, even this many? But then once you get to the older brackets, virtually none of them support Bernie because they're the more conservative ones, they're the more establishment ones. You're talking about a group of folks who are already not a fan of Bernie Sanders, and then you're just going to an even smaller group. So old people don't like Bernie Sanders. So then when you go to black older voters, it's like, oh yeah, well, they're not going to like him. Well, no shit, obviously. You know what I mean? But I really hope he has some serious concerted effort to court African-American voters because they're crucial to the election, no doubt. And so hopefully he'll keep making gains in South Carolina. And then he brings up, it almost sounds like when Bill Maher says, I'm taking a good look at Amy Klobuchar. I was like, what? When he says the Bloomberg stuff. Bloomberg's not going to do anything. Bloomberg's not going to hit the threshold anywhere. Now, there are thresholds of 15% in congressional districts, but I don't think Bloomberg will hit 15 in many congressional districts, but he's certainly not going to hit any 15 statewide. So he's not going to do anything, except he's probably just taking votes away from Joe Biden, which is cool. So go ahead, keep doing that. Keep doing that whole thing. Also, in Iowa, Bernie may actually end up really demolishing because Tulsi and Yang, I think Tulsi's at like 1 or 2 points. I honestly don't remember. Yang is somewhere between 3 and 5. And so those numbers are going to end up, most of them are going to end up going to Bernie because the way it works, as they explained there in Iowa, in each precinct, if a candidate doesn't reach 15% in a precinct, then those people have to go somewhere else. Remember Martin O'Malley? When he dropped out, basically all of his support went to Bernie. And that took Bernie from losing by like 4 points down to just losing by 0.2. So imagine he already has a solid lead. In some polls, he's demolishing. Imagine them taking Tulsi and Yang's percentage and giving it to Bernie as well. That would be crazy. Now, the good thing is that Pete Buttigieg and those other guys, Klobuchar maybe not so much, definitely Buttigieg, he's going to hit the threshold in a lot of precincts, so a lot of that won't end up going to Joe Biden, which will be really good. So hopefully he hits the viability just barely, because then that will really benefit Bernie Sanders. So I was looking really good for Bernie Sanders in conclusion on that one. And then I also want to mention the Super Tuesday numbers. He's doing really well on Super Tuesday. He's only down 2% from an estimate that I read. He's also just had a surge in Texas, which I'll be doing a video on soon. That will be dropping soon. And he is doing well. He's winning California. He's doing well in Massachusetts, Utah, a lot of these states. He's doing very well on Super Tuesday. And finally, last thing I want to talk about is Krystal Ball mentioning that Bernie Sanders having the momentum after Iowa and New Hampshire is massive. Because again, I'm trying to explain to you guys, narrative is what determines everything. Narrative is what determines everything. So if the narrative, which is controlled by the media, right? If the narrative is, hey, look, it's the true narrative, okay? Which is that Bernie Sanders is going to do extremely well because he's going to win Iowa and New Hampshire, and then it's going to set into people's minds. That's what really affects the outcome of the election, because so many people watch outlets like CNN. So all those people watching are like, holy smokes, Bernie actually has a chance to win. Wow, I might actually vote for the guy, or I will vote for the guy. So shout out to Krystal Ball. Did a really great job, and thoroughly disappointed in Andrew Gillum.